Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Extrospective podcast with your host, Zach Villeneuve Snell. Something a little bit different today. I thought I would run through 10 lessons from my first 10 guests. It also gives you guys a little bit of an opportunity to hear me off the cuff. No script, no shirt on today. Recording with my GoPro if you're watching, and as always with my microphone set up. And we're just going to run through on the spot, with no notes made, the 10 lessons I have taken away from my first 10 guests. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast, then be sure to follow and hit the bell, because it means you'll get a notification every single Monday evening when they are released. All right then, so we're going to start off with episode 1, which was with Tom Portsmouth. Now, Tom was a housemate of mine in second year. Tom is an aspiring professional athlete. He's been racing out in Belgium for many years and has recently managed to get a contract with a Pro Conti team in Europe, in Belgium. And that's incredible news. And the thing I learned most about Tom initially, not just from living with him, but also the revelations that he shared on the podcast, was how deep-rooted his competitiveness was inside him, and how this applies to not just cycling for him, but applies and permeates out into the rest of his life, and how this can be both a good and a bad thing. Because in some regards, it means that you can struggle to let go of that in friendly activities or in harmless kind of board games that you'll play. There'll always be that guy that's super competitive that sometimes might take the fun out of it. But in other regards, it means he excels very well at new things because he engages that mindset. For example, I went ice skating with the triathlon club I was a part of last year, and Tom came to that. Neither of us had been ice skating before, and Tom took to it very quickly. And I spent 10 minutes on the ice and then started filming everyone. That's how it went for me. So that's the main thing I learned from Tom is his competitive drive, as a force for good in most aspects, but something that I know that he is processing and learning with regards to how to step back from that in personal off-the-bike life. But I think he's definitely got a lot better than when I first met him, and that's a lesson I'll take away really from him, is how important that competitive drive is. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. So, don't want to spend too long on each person. I'll aim for about 3 minutes. Episode 2. That was with another friend of mine, Max Williams. Now, I think what I learned from Max, if I can think back to what we spoke about, he didn't get on very well with the school system, but he found sport as his way to release, and then he loved cycling the most, and that was taken away from him through an injury, which meant that he couldn't sit on the saddle for very long without causing problems, and that took surgery and many years, or I think over a year, to sort out. So my main takeaway from that lesson, my main lesson from that podcast, my main takeaway from that podcast was that when we are faced with circumstances that are outside of our control, which takes away the thing that we love, we still have control over how we respond. And I think what Max demonstrated to me was the way that he was able to shift from cycling to running despite really wanting to ride a bike, and the frustration that comes with that as he sees all of his friends going off and riding bikes. And of course, there's still a degree of privilege in still being able to run. But I think as a broad takeaway, we can apply this sort of mindset to our lives. We can assess when things don't go our way. Okay, this hasn't happened the way I wanted it to. How can I change the way I perceive this and act accordingly to still make the most out of it? Because I guarantee you, if you approach life's problems with that perspective, you will end up with better outcomes than if you allow yourself to remain the cynic or get too caught up in the expectation of future that is now taken away from you. And I think that's all about, that's essentially what it's about, is expectations, right? We set expectations. If they don't meet those expectations, then we can get quite upset. But we've set those expectations of being able to walk around and live. And right, and these are things we take for granted. So I think that was quite an important lesson, is, circumstance over perspective. Perspective over circumstance. This is not a good one so far. I am really messing up my words, but I'm hoping to do this all in one take, so I hope you'll appreciate that. And I'm also hoping to do this every 10 episodes, so maybe we'll get better. Episode 3, Resisting Comfort for a Better Future, with Giacomo Hedl. Now, Giacomo might not sound familiar. Cycle Nutter might sound more familiar. This guy is 16. He's in year 12. I connected with him through cycling circles on YouTube when I was vlogging last year, and the main lesson I took away from him is that we should impose discipline upon ourselves, do the uncomfortable things in the short run to produce more fruitful, positive outcomes in the long run. Particularly looking at Giacomo, because he is a young man. I don't know if you'd call him as man at 16, but I would certainly say he's a young man. He's not a boy. He's definitely growing into a man. And I think almost that distinction that I've pointed out there speaks to the point I'm making, which is that he is making sacrifices very early on in his life. Now, a lot of people are indulging in the pleasures of playing FIFA, of house parties, of going out, of not looking after themselves, of just going with the flow, spending time with their mates at their own expense sometimes. And I think those things are good. There's balance, right? There's balance in everything. And I've been speaking with him recently. I was asking him how his A-levels are going. And he's absolutely smashing it. He got like 92% best in his class on his macroeconomics test. And hitting the gym every day and still making time to see his girlfriend and his friends. And I think that lesson is a testament to, firstly, it's never too early, or, the sooner the better with these things, with balance and moderation, as I've established. But that if you can trade your current desires for a long-term vision of the potential that exists within you, which can only manifest itself if you put off your current desires, then you will reach your potential, or be close to your potential, do a lot of better good for yourself. But naturally, that means you're doing a lot of better good. That's not really the right way of describing it. You're doing a lot more for everyone else around you and the planet at the end of the day. Because I think in order to be effective human beings, we need to work on ourselves as much as possible so that we can be as good as possible for other people. And there's a net positive to the world. So that's what I'd say for Giacomo. I think it was absolutely fantastic speaking to him. And of course, if you like any of the particular lessons that I am picking out in this video podcast, then please do check them out. Episode 4 it's vulnerability, creativity, and writing with Guy Levi-Costa Cruz. Very, very, very interesting episode. One that I really enjoyed recording, one that I learned a lot in, that I wasn't expecting to learn. I think we recorded for a long time and I cut it down because the discussions were so fruitful. But maybe a bit off-piste. But what I'll do to summarize is the importance that I learned from Guy was reconnecting and recognizing the importance of storytelling and the narrative world. Because I think there's a certain risk of hyper rationalizing everything and moving everything within the bounds of scientific constraint, which doesn't allow the space for the unknown but real, more real substance of life to flourish. So we don't understand, like, where does love come from? Where does grief come from? And yes, there's been work, psychoanalytical work, to uncover emotional processes and traumas and experience, right? And our perception of it. But I think at a very deep level, we can't lose that childlike amazement and storytelling that has been passed down from generation to generation in human beings for a long time. That's how we've communicated with each other. And told we don't pass on messages through information purely. We often use metaphors and stories to illustrate our points. And there's a reason behind that, because everyone, if you can abstract out a complicated topic to a universal truth story of a hero and a villain, not only is it understandable for children to be a warrior and grow into strong young adults, but also as adults, we need that reminder of, like, if I'm not understanding something, some coding problem that you're trying to communicate with me, if you can represent that at the narrative level, I might be able to come at that narrative level, understand it at that level, and then it makes sense in that context. I don't know if I'm making much sense here, but I think I'm making sense. And so what I really, really learned from Guy was the importance of letting that flow and not suppressing it, and ensuring that we don't lose that in society, and doing what I can to invest in my understanding of that, whether it's going back to reading storybooks, fiction, reading in general, and writing in general as well. I think we've lost the art of expressing ourselves as well. If we all wrote poetry and wrote breakup songs and stories of things abstracted out, maybe we wouldn't get so caught up in our own heads and spiral, right? It becomes a lot clearer when you externalize it. Messy thoughts. So lots of lessons there. And a really, really valuable episode. Episode 5 was From Car Park Crits to the Commonwealth Games with Red Walters, aka the Redster. What did I learn from Red? Red had some fantastic wisdom. Firstly, that determination is infinite, and that despite him getting into cycling late, he's able to put his mind to something and tunnel vision it and go head first. And despite potential setbacks, use whatever cards he's played, use the cards that he's been dealt in the most effective way to still climb to the top. Whether that was leveraging his social reach or ensuring that he was becoming more of a well-rounded athlete, I think what I learned from Red was that, like, anything is possible. I think Red's determination was quite unique in that regard. And also, I did see the competitiveness emerge, and this was the first time it kind of clicked with me. And I hope you appreciate this as well. I'm learning in public. That's one of the premises of this podcast. Is when I connected the fact that Tom and Red, obviously both cyclists, both performance cyclists on the bubble of being a pro, they both were very competitive, and it made me question. And I said to them in these podcasts, I said, I don't think I'm that competitive. But actually, when I'm honest with myself, when I think of my primal, like, most raw thought processes in my brain, when I think about podcasting, when I think about in any kind of competitive sense that might exist with cycling or gym, right? But mainly with endeavors that you care about and you're building, I have a ruthless creative mindset. I have a ruthless competitive mindset that I think I've suppressed it potentially. I don't know whether that's because as young boys we're told to suppress it subconsciously. And it's strange to admit, but as much as I do think it's a zero-sum game in life and that you can encourage and uplift people in your circle, there's still a voice in the back of my head that says, you are incredible and no one can come close to you in what you do. And in a really aggressive way. It's like just being absolutely ruthless. Like, no one has any idea how successful I'm going to be. And that's not really me speaking. I would never verbalize that. And that doesn't, but that I have deep rooted thoughts about that. And it's the channeling of that into something productive and still being a very, very giving, loving person. And I honestly think from speaking with Red and Tom, they both said, if someone's next to them in a race, looking underneath the lane rope in swimming or in a sprint for Red, it's like they are winning. They are going to win. They are better than the other person. It's like animalistic instinct, and I definitely have that. So what Red really highlighted to me was that again, really. Maybe that's not a specific lesson from Red, but I think that's what I learnt when I kind of put two and two together, and I realised that there was a trend, and that I'd been telling them I wasn't competitive, and really, maybe I am. And I actually think everyone is if they're honest, and it's just a degree of honesty, right? Because no one wants to be the worst at something. No one would be happy with being mediocre. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but what I saw with Red was against odds, he has done incredibly well for himself. Determination is infinite, and that we're all competitive secretly. We're all competitive whether we admit it or not. Episode 6. Building the world's first automated running coaching business with Ben Parker. Now, I think Ben has had some experience now of podcasting and speaking, because he delivered this episode very succinctly, and it shows on the plays on Spotify. And I really learned a lot from Ben. I really did. I think he's an incredibly driven individual. I really aspire to be like him, specifically in the way that he balances his career, his relationships, and his athletic endeavors in the way that I would like to. Now, I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm sure he's still struggling with things and ironing things out, but I definitely see him as someone that I would like to embody those sorts of skills to be able to balance those things, or at least be better at balancing those things. And one of the main lessons I learned from Ben is that there's no coincidence that the average income of an Ironman athlete is $250,000 a year. There's no coincidence that hyperachievers are hyperachievers in more than one dimension. It's because once you get into that mindset of success and working out what's going to take to go the extra mile, and the networking abilities and communication abilities, everything transfers between things. And I think if you're a disciplined individual, you're going to be disciplined toward the pursuit, wherever that may be, in whatever context. So whether that's putting in a 3-hour bike ride followed by a half-an-hour run, brick session in the morning, and then a swim in the evening, and then an S&C gym session the next day, and then after that S&C gym session, going to work 10 hours as a top dog lawyer. I think balancing those things, and of course, holding down a successful and happy, stable relationship, even a family later on down the line. It's possible to do all those things. It really is. Really is. But you need to be driven. You need to be successful. Well, the success is the symptom of the driven. But you know what I mean. I'm mincing my words here. I really am. I feel like what I've said so far, I could have delivered so much better. But we press on. Excuse me. So yeah, that's what I learned from Ben. Really, is the fact that it's no coincidence that hyper successful people are hyper successful in many dimensions, and I think he demonstrates that. And I really, really support what he's doing with Runner. Check it out if you haven't already. Episode 7. Growing through grief into a professional career with Finn Wakeham. I've known Finn for 5 years. He's an incredible individual. He's very thoughtful. He's very motivated. He's very responsible, independent, kind, loving. I really have a lot of respect for Finn. And I think what I learned from Finn, and naturally because it was the nature of his personal story unraveling in the podcast, so I've learned a lot from Finn in general. But I think a takeaway from this podcast episode was that I think in the self-development world there is too much, almost fetishization over locking yourself away for 6 months, going ghost mode, going silent, not really using anyone else or bouncing off anyone else for support or advice, and just doing it all on your own. I think there's definitely that self development where it's almost like you don't want to be dependable. You don't want to be dependent on other people, and to an extent, that's good. It's good to be self-reliant to a degree, and not be moping over things which are not significant in the grand scheme of things, with relative to what life could be. I don't know if that makes much sense, but essentially, there's a time and place for leaning into people, but that it's important to lean into people when there is the time and the place. And I think what we need to do better is allowing space for our friends and our colleagues to open up about what is challenging for them, and encouraging them to go and seek advice from experts and giving them space to talk, because we are social creatures. We're meant to do life in community. We aren't meant to self-develop as hermits on our own. And I think Finn alluded to the importance of therapy, and well, particularly for him with the grief counselling, and the fact that he delayed that and put that off and then did it later. He said you'd rather do it sooner. And so I think the lesson from him really is that we should aspire to be more, I don't know how to phrase this, be more open, be more flowing. Maybe that's not the right word. For example, I'll give an example. I'll use the Guy storytelling right here. So I think if I had just broken up with a partner of mine, with a girlfriend, for example, rather than keeping that pent up and using it as fuel and fighting my demons in the gym, which I guess sometimes it can be a good vice, good motivation to get to the gym, but that's not lasting. It's fleeting, and they're also living in your head rent free if you do that. So you've got to be careful. But I think if that were to happen, it's just being comfortable and open, having people around you to just talk absolute rubbish at them, to unpack your thoughts, to unwind them, to write them down, to speak to other people sooner rather than later. Because humans organize their thoughts through conversation and through dialogue. And it's something that I've been incredibly fortunate to have people like Finn in my life, where I've been through challenging times. I remember actually last summer, something happened. Things were happening with my ex-girlfriend, or I was thinking things were happening, and I just got in my own head. And when you get in your own head and you kind of cyclically spiral without bouncing off of someone else, it can be quite dangerous because you don't have anyone to challenge your thoughts, not in a harsh or demeaning way, but challenge them in like, come on, Zach, like, is this you thinking, or is this just the intrusive thought? And I think I remember going for drinks with Finn and Josh, two of my friends from back home, and they just allowed me space to be an absolute muppet. Like, I look back on it now. I look back on it probably a month or two afterwards, and I was almost like apologetic for it, because the things that I was coming out with and splurging out and was just mopey, emotional nonsense. But I needed that space to process it, because otherwise that could have led to more lasting damage with the way I view relationships, or the way I view myself, or anything, right? Because it gets all pent up. So I needed them to bounce off of, and not necessarily to give advice, but to just listen to me. And a lot of the time in therapy, not that I'm a therapist yet, but the person already knows the answers. You're just there to ask the right questions, or just to get them to ask the right questions, right? So that and conversation with your friends aren't exactly like therapy, but in a way it is therapy to talk out those things. And I think, yeah, sorry, I realize I'm mumbling on here, but the summary is that it's very, very useful and important to talk and to surround yourself with people and not to try and do it alone. And I know that's drummed into our heads on social media, but I think it's one thing to like read it as a cool carousel, but another thing to actually implement it and have the vulnerability to do that and open up, because it's still a problem. Like, it's not like, yeah, and for a while I also thought that this was no longer a problem because I was doing it, but then I realized other people still have those things pent up. So I'd encourage you, and I would encourage you particularly to reach out to me, or if it's or if you're having thoughts that you're worried or scared about, then to reach out to the helplines mentioned on the podcast with Finn. But yeah, please do get in touch with me if it's something that you just are worried about or struggling with that isn't like super serious, but still valid. And please do, and I'll be more than happy to jump on a call and just listen to you for half an hour. Episode 8: From International Rower to Gut Health Entrepreneur, with Ben Smith live. This was insane to me. I have to say for anyone listening, this was insane. It was surreal. Not because Ben's any sort of celebrity, not that he's any better or worse than you and I, but he has built his personal brand to a significant following across social medias. 150k on YouTube, 150k on Instagram. And if you think that all of the guests that I've had up to this point have all been people within my network, friends or connections that I've been privileged enough to come across, such as Ben Parker. Ben Smith Live, I didn't know. I'd followed him as a follower for 3 months, really interested in his gut health advice because of his IBS story. I mean, I won't go into it, but you can check the episode out. So I was kind of blown away when he reached out. What I learned initially from him, before we even recorded the podcast, is the value of making something look professional and clean cut and doing a good job of something. Despite there being a lot of room for improvement, he liked the feed. When he examined my Instagram profile, he said, "Look, it's looking pretty good," and he liked the psychological spin, which I hope is providing value to people, because in the same way that I've just described this therapy, not in the same way, but my podcast, hopefully for an individual like him and for lots of people, as much as I'm learning, it gives them an opportunity to share their story. Maybe that's the first time that they've sat down long form and shared their story from a psychological perspective, from childhood to where they are now. I mean, I personally find that very interesting for me. And I don't think I've ever been given the opportunity in that regard. And I think it'd be super useful. So maybe someone can interview me for a podcast episode. But I think I'm not that interesting compared to their guests so far. So maybe we'll save that for another day. But that was the first lesson. Is the opportunity that I was providing was actually a good one for people, and a reminder of that. But I think a lesson from Ben specifically would probably be that thing is, there are so many. It's such a long podcast, but it was so good. Like I couldn't cut it down. We were recording for 3 hours. It's 2 hours 16. I really couldn't cut it down anymore because I'd just be cutting out things that were valuable. So it was really, really, really good episode. So what did I actually learn from Ben's podcast? Well, I would say the fact that it takes a lot of energy and hard work to build something meaningful. I think it's all too easy to see surface level results. It's all too easy. It's the old cliche of no overnight success, but I really mean it, because it's very easy to lessen someone's achievements because of the perceptive relative easiness of something, if that makes sense. So, for example, he spoke about the journey that he had to just grind for like basically a year just to get this thing off the ground. And yes, it's successful now due to immense sacrifice on his part and a lot of risk tolerance, with starving the business of money, his own money initially, to £0 to £0, on the day of the launch. It's like that takes a lot of time. There's no overnight success. And what you see as a successful individual now, or growingly successful, was once shy, was once ill, was once not an expert in gut health, and doesn't know how to code still. You pay someone else to build it out. So yeah, just it takes time. So keep plugging away. That's all I'd say. And that applies specifically to him building his personal brand as well. He'd been doing it for like 4 or 5 years. So luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And he was preparing all that time. The opportunity came when he healed himself from IBS, and here he is today. So make of that what you will, and apply it in your own context. Episode 9. Whew, rattling through these. The Power of Podcasting and Driving Social Mobility with David McIntosh. David McIntosh. Development by D. Development by D? D by D. Development by David. What a legend. Honestly, what a legend. What a kind guy. I don't think I've met a guy who's been so openly giving from the offset and so kind in my life. So it's really interesting actually, because in doing my research before the podcast with David, I scrolled back on his Instagram and I realized that I'd liked his first few posts about his first few podcasts. And I do remember seeing them. I don't know how I came across them though, because he's in mutual circles. Anyway, this isn't about that. So he really, really inspired me. He really inspired me to make this thing. So I have to give a lot of props to David. I almost think when I asked the question, who are you in 2022 at the beginning of the podcast? I know that's such a generic question, but I feel as though I'm copying because I've listened to his podcast and probably a handful of others. Obviously, that's going to shape how I do mine. And I'm inspired, but I hope I'm not copying you, David, if you're watching and listening. But yes, what did I learn from David? I learned primarily in the importance of social mobility. It's not really something I'd come across. I knew probably only from him. I knew of the importance of what the term describes, generally speaking, but I didn't know social mobility as a term. I didn't know the extent of it. I didn't know the discipline of it. I say discipline. It's not really the right word. I mean, like the number of organisations that are driving it and going into schools and doing all that sort of thing. I think it's very easy to look at your own unique privilege and circumstances and be ungrateful or not grateful enough. And I think accounting for race, sexuality, gender, whatever else, like whatever other group dimension, your attractiveness, height, weight, all of those group characteristics, I think, kind of fall away at the feet of socioeconomic background, because I think that's ultimately the biggest predictor of opportunity and access to opportunity and visibility of opportunity, right? And I think someone like David, who has grown up in working class, remote, rural village in Scotland and made it to a very good place in one of the UK's largest consultancy accountant firms, financial firms, KPMG, I think that speaks volumes of how important it is to get those opportunities and those access to opportunities out to everyone, because I'm a very, very, very big believer in equality of opportunity. And a part of me, when I was like 17, 18, formulating my political opinions, thought that we've achieved equality of opportunity. We shouldn't strive for outcome, which is still something I believe, but I don't think we believed equality of opportunity. I don't believe we've achieved equality of opportunity. And I think specifically where that's lacking is not only socioeconomic, but like what would it be? Just geographical, but geographical very much tied to socioeconomic, because it's like the rich get rich, the poor get rich, but less. So obviously the discrepancy in locations is important. And I think something like a rural village in Scotland, obviously suffers from that. So, yeah, in a long-winded way, I think the importance of showing people opportunity and ensuring that every child feels like that they can go on to do and be anything. And if they put their mind to it, they can achieve it. I think that's it. I think that's the message. Especially something as I want to go into potentially like developmental psychology as a clinician. Okay. Now for episode 10, which hasn't released yet at the time of recording, but I have recorded it, therefore I will remember, and hopefully you would have listened to it by the time you listen to this. And if you haven't listened to it, then go back and check it out, because it was very, very interesting. Episode 10, Traveling the World and Becoming the Planet Doctor with Greg Schwartz, PhD, or Dr. Greg Schwartz. Greg. I think immediately the first thing that comes to mind is the importance of traveling, the importance of getting out there and exposing yourself to other cultures and traditions and ways of life. I know I used the rule of 3 there to basically say the same thing each time. But you know what I mean. I think he travelled 40 countries, much of them in his 20s, and was able to connect with the planet and see the environmental devastation that was happening in the third world, which we aren't exposed to sustain our lifestyles. And I think that's really important. So I think there's 2 lessons there. It's travel a lot to get that appreciation, but also in your day-to-day, take action on what can be more sustainable and ethical. And I think he is a vegan. I'm a vegan of 7 years. I think looking into something like veganism and being more ethical with your clothes choices, as in not coming from sweatshops, and just generally speaking, trying to be more conscious of your purchases is a good idea. You know, the process that's allowed that thing to so conveniently get to your front door, how has that happened? The process that's allowed that to so conveniently appear in your supermarket, how has that happened? And is that process something that you're okay with? And I think connecting with that obviously can be quite vivid at the same time as traveling, because you can see it. But also, I think those are 2 distinct points. You know, traveling just purely to get out there and live beyond the comfort zone. That's something we talk about in the podcast. You know, to people are too safe. But also connecting with and having appreciation for where things have come from. And making more informed consumer decisions rather than consuming purely out of convenience. So, yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from Greg as well, you know, talking about, I've said quite a lot. I think it's my filler word. I use too much, so best believe I am working on it for future podcast episodes. But I think when I try too hard not to say those filler words, I end up sounding a little bit like this, which is probably a bit robotic, because I am thinking about the words that I'm going to use more carefully each and every word, as to avoid saying filler words, but that results in not thinking about what I'm actually going to say as much, if that makes sense. My brain power is going more towards that. Anyway, 10 lessons, or probably closer to 20 lessons. I don't know how many of those I split into 2, but let's just pretend it was 10 lessons from 10 episodes. 10 weeks, going strong. Got lots of very exciting guests lined up. Lots of very, very exciting guests lined up. Lots of guests that are potentially coming on, which haven't booked on yet. But genuinely speaking, this podcast has been such a blessing. Really, really has. I've enjoyed this podcasting like nothing else I've ever done before. It's given me more joy and fulfillment than any other endeavors I've pursued before. And I've pursued a lot of things and failed a lot of things and been embarrassed many times. But I think my decision to start this has been a very, very good one. To learn a lot about myself, to learn a lot about others, to extrapolate and aggregate those lessons out to universal truths, so that not only for myself, but for you guys, you can make better informed decisions, learn some trivia along the way, hopefully find some things funny. And I think that's the purpose of the podcast, is to learn in public and pursue my curiosity with a psychological lens, but not always. And I hope that everyone listening to this can appreciate that is something that we need to do more of. Because I think a lot of bad could be avoided if more people pursued introspection and analysed their toxic behaviours and tried to be better human beings at the psychological level, rather than just claiming morality through "I think this." It's like, no, but who are you and what do you act like? And then learning from others in the way that I am, hopefully to avoid mistakes. Anyway, I'm very clearly waffling, so I divulge. What's the word? I digress. 10 lessons from 10 episodes. This has been Zach Villeneuve-Snell, host of the Extrospective podcast. Thanks for listening, and I shall see you next week for episode 11 with Inigo Horton. Cheers!